Hello and welcome to History Lab Studio, where we bring you intimate conversations about history of all kinds. This episode is a conversation between Anna Clark and fellow historian Heather Goodall, a scholar whose work reshaped understandings of history in Australia and beyond. Across more than 50 years of research in community collaboration and activism, Heather showed what history can do, how it can serve social justice, deepen relationships to place, and give people tools to understand their own lives and struggles. Heather was diagnosed with motor neuron disease in 2025 and died in January 2026. Here, she reflects on her life's work, from oral history along the Darling River to Indian seamen and Indonesian independence, from the Georges River and environmental activism to teaching history beyond the academy. This is a conversation about history as a lived practice, shaped by place, collaboration, and a belief in the power of ordinary people. Thank you, Heather.
Heather Goodall, thank you so much for joining me today. And I realise that the timing of this conversation has been prompted by illness, but I do really hope, actually, that what people hear in this interview is strength and force of your work over many years that will continue to impact generations of historians, many of us working in the discipline of history as researchers, academics, community historians and history teachers are really indebted to your work and have been shaped by it. So I'm going to start broad but simple, I hope. What drew you to history?
Well, look, that's a lovely introduction, Anna. Thank you for that. I think my childhood involved my mother telling me stories about family history and her young life. The Second World War was a huge part of the lives of people who were her age. She was born in the late 1920s, and she and her friends all had stories about the war and about and then about family history. Mum was interested in family history and pursued it. And so it was that which drew me to it. But it was really high school. I think I got interested in high school, and I had some good teachers and some interesting topics, and I was interested enough to realise that this was something that I wanted to do. But ever since I was 5, I'd wanted to be a doctor. And I was determined I was going to be a doctor. And so was in my family, who weren't very well off, wanted to support me. Nobody in my family had ever been to university. And so there was a real commitment to this idea. And I was still determined I was going to do medicine. And I enrolled in medicine. I started first year. And I became aware. I passed first year and went into second year, but by that stage I'd become aware of how all-absorbing a career in medicine was. It would be such a dominant part of my life that I would never get a chance to do the history, any sort of work that I wanted to do, that I really cared about, that I cared about as well. I mean, I wanted to do medicine. I was lucky in that I met lots of lovely people doing medicine, and I met my future husband, Paul, and I in that first year, 1970, Paul and I were part of the moratorium movement. And I suppose that's the other strand that's going on, as well as me heading into end of high school and university, was that I was becoming politically interested. And I got involved in a number of, I was interested in particularly in the anti-Vietnam War movement at that stage. And I was aware of the anti-racism movement developing, but it wasn't a big part of what I was doing. It was really the anti-war movement. And so when I started in first year at university, I was looking for people who were interested in that way. And Paul was interested in that way. So we'd have to be there for, 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock physics lectures for medicine, which I shudder to think how I managed to do that. But Paul would be sitting up the back of the room reading the paper, and I'd be able to go up and sit with him and talk about the latest news that was coming through. And it was was so exciting to find just one or two people in medicine who were interested and involved. And we were part of the anti-Vietnam moratoria in that year. There were two. And in the second one, I managed to get Paul arrested, which was entirely not his fault. But I was abusing the police because they were forcing us to trample people in front of us. And so they reached over and grabbed Paul and took him, which cemented our relationship, I'd have to say.
The indebtedness.
Yeah, but I was becoming more involved in Paul's interests, which were in the anti-racist movement. He'd been involved in the Gurindji campaigns as a high school student. And it was through Paul that we became, both of us, involved in the anti-racism movement at the university. And I met someone who became a very good friend, Peter Tobin, who was a lawyer at that stage, final year law student, and had been working closely with Aboriginal activists and people who'd begun the Aboriginal legal service. So it was through them that I became involved in that activity. Peter was a very close friend of ours, and we went and he was stationed at Brewarrina. It was the first rural office at all of the legal service, and we stayed with him up there, and we got to know a lot of people up there. And the field officer, Tombo Winters particularly, Essie Coffey, Stephen Gordon were also really important. But Tombo became a close friend. And the people from up there would stay at our place. We had another house in Glebe at that stage. And they'd stay with us when they came to Sydney. And so we got to know people very well over the years. Peter Tobin was at Brewarrina for 2 years or so as the lawyer, and then he came back to the Sydney office, and he was principal solicitor there for a while, maintaining lots of contact. But his area, when he first went up there, went from Collarenebri in the east. So not Moree. There was another lawyer stationed at Moree a little while later, but from Collarenebri, which is between Moree and Walgett, down the Darling River, up to the border, right to the corner country, Tipperburra, and all the way down to Dareton, where the Darling River joins the Murray. And inland from, Dubbo, really, it was really across that whole was more than a quadrant. It was really half of New South Wales. And he had a big yellow P76 that he used to drive around, which was very, very big and very loud, and a real country car, but bright yellow. But he was not only a good friend, but he was important in introducing me to insights about rural New South Wales, about rural living and racism and how it worked. And then after he came back down to Sydney, I still kept in touch with people. People stayed at my place, and I had lots of time talking to people. So in that sense, I was involved, and Paul and I were both involved. He was involved as a doctor. He worked with Fred Hollows quite a bit at Burke and places like that. And I kept in touch with people as I went through my history. I forgot to talk to you about that. I changed faculties. I got halfway through second year medicine, and I thought I'll never get to do the things I want to do as well. And so I ended up making the really difficult decision. I'd been to an anti-war conference over the summer holidays, which opened up again for me all the sorts of political, analytical, social research I could be doing. So when I came back into medicine, it was really clear to me, and second year is really hard, so it was very clear to me that I would really have to devote my whole life to it. And so by, a little way into the year, I realised that I needed to change faculties. So that was a really hard decision, very hard for my family, particularly my father, who invested a lot, bought a business and was struggling with a very difficult business as a milkman. And it was really hard work for him. And all of this was because I'd been determined to go to university, and I had 2 younger brothers, and he assumed he would have to support them. It was hard for them. But so I changed faculties, and I got, in time, I could only, because I'd used my Commonwealth Scholarship for my medical subjects, I could only do 2 art subjects, and I chose English and history. And the English that Sydney University was offering at that stage, there was a lot of medieval English, and it wasn't English that really excited me. It wasn't contemporary literature, which was what had really excited me at school. And the history work was just fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I did an Australian history course in first year, and then my second year I did an intellectual history course with Bob Dreyer and Rob McLaughlin, which was fantastic. Introduced me to a whole lot of things that I'd never thought of, which were wonderful. And then in third year, I did an Indian nationalism course with Jim Massalos, which was just breathtaking. And I mean, I would have considered doing further study in Indian history, but my language skills are zero. I'm good at I learn through my eyes, not my ears, and my attempts to learn Hindi were just embarrassingly bad. And I realised I wouldn't be able to pursue this. But what excited me so much about Jim's course was the social history approach, his methodology. And I was really interested in the approach that he took, working with, the social history of communities and villages and activists was just the most important thing for me. And so I realised that I wasn't going to be able to speak Hindi or anything else for that matter, certainly not Urdu, and I wouldn't be able to pursue a career of further study. But what I might be able to do was to draw on this methodology and develop it. And so I worked in my honours year in history with Ken Cable, and I looked at the Coolie Labor debates in Australia. So I was looking at the ways in which racial attitudes are expressed and formed and debated. And a lot of that involved the anxiety and the anger about Indians and Coolie labour and the basically the early white Australia expressions. And so I explored that a little bit in my honours degree. And then in the process of, I was offered a doctorate, a position to do a PhD after that. And I remember talking around with people, and I really wanted to pursue the social history work that Jim Massalos had introduced me to. And I remember talking to Tombo Winters, the legal service officer, the field officer at Brewarrina, and I was explaining to Tom that what I was going to do was do this further study, and I really wanted to interview people about their memories. And he said, "Oh, we got a lot of old people up here you could talk to." And it was just to have an invitation from Tombo was just wonderful, just wonderful. And by this stage also, Paul's work, as with Fred Hollows, as I said, but also with the Aboriginal Medical Service, meant that he'd met Aboriginal people who were involved in that medical dimension or the health service dimension. And one of the people he met and got to know very well was Isabel Flick, who was a cook in the hospital at Prince Alfred. She'd come down from Collarenebri with her family to get her kids into school in Sydney, and she was living in Annandale at the time, and I spent a bit of time with Paul. We went over to Isabel's place, hung out with Isabel, and met her family. And I met her niece, Barbara, and another niece, Karen, and Joey, her nephew, who were her brother Joe and her sister-in-law Isabel Walford's kids. Met other members of the family. And so the ideas that Tombo had suggested about all these old people who were up along the Darling River had real resonance. I started to think of all the people that I could talk to, the people I'd met and got to know, and whose stories I'd love to hear. And so that's the way it developed, except that I was allocated a supervisor at Sydney University, Heather Goodall, who was actually she's a very good historian in a lot of ways, a good feminist historian, and was enormously helpful to me at the end of my doctorate in editing and helping me shape the finished product, but was very uncomfortable at the beginning with the idea of me working in this Aboriginal history area. And I had other people whose names I've forgotten who were in the history department who said, why would you want to talk to Aboriginal people about the past? One of them said to me, look, there's a lot of retired history professors you could talk to who'd had much more reliable memories to tell you about. And it was really extraordinary. There was a lot of resistance from the history department to me taking up this topic. And so, I was supported by lovely people who were still in other areas of the history department, like Jim Maslos and others. But in the Australian history area, there was real reluctance to support this idea. But we got it through. And I value Heather's support for having supported me to do that. Ken Cable was important too in supporting me, and they had enough confidence in me to sort of push through with it. So that's when I started doing the doctorate.
Earlier this year, you were awarded the annual citation for the History Council of New South Wales for 50 years of historical research and community engagement, which is a long. And before I came, I popped you up on the UTS staff page, and I was scrolling down all the things you'd done, and I realised at the bottom that there were 10 more pages of projects on the UTS staff webpage. Publications, exhibitions, collections across, as you said, Indian history, working class histories, biography, history of New South Wales, histories of rivers, histories of waterways, Aboriginal history, histories of mothers and mothering, refugees, histories of place, histories of education. If you could think about your work as a book, what connects these chapters, do you think?
I think, there was actually a thread that went through it, but I think the great value of working with oral history, with a social history approach, is that you learn an enormous amount about all aspects of people's lives. And I think one of the things that startled me when I first started, I'd come out of a, Labor Party family and a good working class background. And so I went up to Brewarrina, and this is after I'd, gone through 4 years of history. I went up to Brewarrina expecting stories of labour exploitation, poor wages, brutality in work environments, racism, unemployment. And all people wanted to talk about was kids being taken away. They really did. So people wanted to talk about the sisters they'd never seen and the cousins who'd gone.
And no one had ever asked them, right?
Well, people had tried to find them.
No, but as a historian interested in that. Well, in that story, who had...
There was certainly somebody at the time. So Peter Reid was a very important historian who was working on this at the time, and Peter's role was to really draw a very close focus on the kids who'd been taken away, and on the families. And I think what I did. I drew. Peter had published a little bit at that stage, and I was beginning to draw on his work, and I was so impressed by I was overwhelmed and overcome by the focus that people at Brewarrina wanted to do, and all along the river wanted to place on this. Particularly that stretch from Colorado-Moree through down to Burke, they really wanted to talk about kids being taken away, and the fact they'd never been able to find them again, or that some people had come back. And so some people came back with white babies, some people just fought their way back, some people never came back at all. And so I was talking to people who had lost kids, they'd lost siblings when they were youngish kids. You know, they might have been 6 or 8 or 10, and had been thinking about them all these years. By this stage, they might be in their 50s or their 60s. And so it was quite a long stretch of time that people had been caring and wondering what had happened, or going through the consequences of the ways kids came back. Sometimes wonderfully well and enriched and happy to be back. Other times embittered and angry and never the same as they had been, or isolated, and so that whole experience was very much, to me, one of the things that I wanted to explore. So it wasn't only the actual structure of the removal of children, but it was how this worked in the communities and how it shaped my abiding sort of focus was land, and I was trying to look at how communities engage with land, and I expanded the areas that I was working in to further downstream, and there's a different emphasis among Barkindji and other people further down the river, further downstream, who'd actually had less impact from the Protection Board in the removal of children. So it was interesting to recognise that there was different experiences in different places, which had been about the reach of the bureaucracy. And I found oral history to be really rewarding in, as I said, explaining or opening up the whole dimension of people's lives. So mothers were important, the experience of siblings and of whole families. And it impacted the way people moved and where they lived. So people were moving to centralised stations because if they stayed away or out in a smaller settlement, their kids would be taken away. So the role of the power to remove children was incredibly important in shaping people's lives and locations and their relationship to land. And so it was that approach that I was following as I went through.
And did that approach then influence your own sense of history work? I mean, the process of the oral history allowed you to get these stories, perhaps that you might never have listened to, and to amplify those stories. But did it also affect how you practiced as a historian going forward?
I think it did. It had
that connection you have to communities that,
yes,
and people, and you sort of, in a sense, become collaborators, don't you?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I had a lot to do with other people doing oral history at the time, and I was very aware of the importance of thinking about the ethics of this work and how, in fact, you were collaborating with people. And I was bringing my own, at least I hadn't imposed my focus on labour history onto all these families who wanted to talk about children being taken away. But nevertheless, my understanding and learning was very much shaping the questions I asked and the responses I had. But I also found, and this was partly because people that I talked to wanted answers. They wanted more than their own experience. So I was looking more at archives than I had expected I would be doing. And I found it helpful to do that. So I found it helpful. A lot of the archival material about Aboriginal people had been destroyed because it was regarded as not important. So Aboriginal people's letters to the Protection Board had all been thrown out. They'd all been destroyed for this period. But what we did have was the Protection Board's minutes. And there were responses in there, and it gave an idea of the sort of pressure which Aboriginal people had been placing to try and find their kids and get their kids back. And it allowed me to look at the mechanisms of the government policies and the bureaucracies and the way individuals in those bureaucracies operated, and to recognise, in fact, how different the bureaucracies looked from different directions, so that for Aboriginal people, the Aborigines Protection Board was overwhelmingly powerful. It had the police backing. But from the position of the government, the Protection Board was a minor little piece of bureaucracy. It got very little funding and no support, and had to fight and struggle to get any policies through. So it was interesting to see those different perspectives, and archives became important, and I took a lot of archival material back to communities, as well as, of course, the transcripts of the interviews that I'd done, and the interviews themselves. Kirsten Thorpe, who's a wonderful First Nations archivist at UTS now, but having worked in the State Library and other places, Kirsten was always been interested in my work and has been incredibly supportive and helpful. And she organised to copy all of my original audio, which, I mean, I'd done in the first place and copied it, and everybody had copies of everything I'd done. But of course, in the intervening years, it had been taped over, or, something had happened, the dog had eaten it or something. And so Kirsten retaped all of those and took them back up to the Dharrewa Elders Group in Walgett, and gave people a lot of the recordings of the interviews that had been done when she came to work at UTS, which was just wonderful.
That's amazing.
Great thing to do.
Two things that strike me from that conversation. One of them is a delightful thing, which is maybe, Michael Jackson being taped over your interview. It's one of the images that come to mind.
Exactly.
The other one is...
Well, it was probably more like Charlie Pride in those days.
Yeah.
Thank you, not Michael.
The other one is a very sort of sad, almost violent feeling that comes into my heart listening to you talk, which is kids getting taken away and then the letters being destroyed of parents loving their kids. And so kids can't find... it's like the banality of evil or something, isn't it? It's very this state, the power of a state to squash can be done in seemingly small ways that just have intergenerational horror, really.
And these were decisions that were made not in order to sever relationships, but out of disrespect and disinterest.
Yeah,
Aboriginal letters weren't important, so it wasn't important to keep them.
Yeah.
Which meant that many, many people, as you say, from both directions of the kids taken and the families, weren't able to build the connections between them. It was just really heartbreaking, really heartbreaking. But one of the other aspects of the community oral history work was that I learned a great deal about family networks. And that's one of the ways that my work developed, I think. Certainly there was a lot of talking, a lot of the recording that I did and a lot of the time that I spent in country areas was time spent on riverbanks. Fishing. Well, I never caught anything that was worth catching, unlike you, Anna, but I spent a lot of time talking with people as they fished, and I, helped to get the bait out of the bait box and things like that. So I tried to help and I tried not to distract, and I was really eager to hear the stories that people told me and their grandkids and others as they sat for hours on the riverbank waiting for a bite. So the river and places and people's stories were all tied up together, and it was important in lots of ways for me for the rest of my work. But the other thing that was important was thinking about the family networks that were there, and quite a number of the families that I spent time with had a parent, father, grandfather, who was from India. The Flick family had a grandfather who was from Africa. He was an African American, so he'd come from America, but of African descent. And a number of Indians, and I became, with echoes of Jim Massalos and the social history work that he'd introduced me to, I began exploring, and I talked to Jim about this. I remember Jim saying, well, of course, these people were all Lascars, weren't they? And I thought, yeah, I could be looking at shipping records, couldn't I? And thinking about people who'd come on, and how did they get to Australia? They were kept out as coolie labourers. They weren't allowed in. But they formed most of the seamen on British shipping and other shipping that came through into all the ports in Australia. So I started looking at them, and I started looking at Lascars and looking for archives, and particularly one of the families of a number of the activists whom I'd been close to along the Darling River had a grandfather who was George Fernando. And George Fernando was indeed a Lascar, as I was able to find out. The family knew that he jumped ship, and that the main thing he taught them about his Indian culture was that he was he became a shearer's cook, and he made great curries. So people knew a little bit about him, but not very much about his other background or where he came from. He was in fact Sri Lankan, as it turned out, as a number of Fernandos were, but there's also Fernandos on the Portuguese coast, the eastern coast of India, as well as on the western coast. And in the process of looking at the archives, I found this whole collection of the Indian Seamen's Union in Australia, which had the languages included in it were not only English, but Urdu and Devanagari and the anglicised form of Hindi as well. And it had been marked down as either Arabic or Russian. Nobody had ever looked at it. Nobody had looked at this. There were 5 boxes of archives of the Indian Seamen's Union in Australia from the 1944, I think it got set up. Wow. And so I started looking at it. I found all this amazing stuff about Indian activists as they were. The Indian Seamen's Union in India was one of the more left-wing unions, one of the early unions and one of the more left-wing unions in the country. But it only covered seamen who were within Indian waters, within the waters of the area that could be covered by India or British India then, in the early days. And the seamen, when they were in Australia or in Australian waters, couldn't be covered by their own union. So they'd set up this union, the Indian Seamen's Union in Australia, and they'd been collaborating with the Australian Seamen's Union, but they particularly wanted the Seamen's Union, the Australian Seamen's Union couldn't really cover them either. And this became a real issue when the Indonesians declared independence in 1945 at the end of the war. There was an independent struggle going on in India. The Indian Seamen's Union was a very active supporter of independence. Yes, it goes beyond that. And so the Indian Seamen's Union was in Australia, the Indian seamen in Australia were really eager to be able to support the Indonesian nationalists, and particularly when the Dutch decided they weren't going to accept the independence declaration and that they were going to move back in. And the discussion then developed between the Indonesian seamen who were still in Australia before they were deported, the Australian Unionists in the waterside workers really, rather than the Seamen's Union who didn't have, it was mainly the waterside workers who decided they would boycott Dutch shipping and any shipping, British shipping going to the Indies to supply the Dutch. But there wouldn't have been a boycott. There couldn't have been a boycott. The ships wouldn't have been stopped simply because the seamen hadn't loaded them. There were other ways to load the ships. They only stopped because the Indian seamen walked off the ships. They walked off all the British ships and they walked off the ships they were on that were the Dutch ships. And that's the reason there was a boycott of material going to the Dutch in the Netherlands East Indies. But the waterside workers were reluctant to actually recognise, or they were just sort of not very interested in the Indian Seamen's Union in Australia. The Australian Seamen's Union was much more supportive, but it wasn't an active part of the boycott. So if you read Lockwood's book, the Black Armada book, you find a bit in there about the Indians, but you don't actually find all that much. And in the Joris Evans film, Indonesia Calling, it's interesting if you have a look at that. By the time Joris Evans made that film, most of the Indonesians had been deported. So the people who appear as Indonesians in that film are actually Indians. They're Indians who had all walked off the ships, and they were housed in the Lido, which was a Dutch hostel. It was a hotel that the Dutch had taken over for their own seamen, and the Indian strikers were there. And they'd been an active part. Some of them were in the Communist Party, some of them weren't. They were all activists in this process of recruiting, telling new seamen who were coming on about what was happening. But it's interesting that most of them are depicted in that film as if they were Indonesians when in fact they're Indians. I started off researching Indian seamen and their activism in supporting Indonesian nationalism. But there was something else going on at the same time, which was that the Second World War had ended and the British had assumed leadership of what was called the Southeast Asian Command. And their role was supposed to be to accept the Japanese surrender in various places and then restore order to the various places that the Japanese had invaded. However, for the British, who were still holding on to their colonies, that meant in the Netherlands East Indies restoring Dutch control. And so the British made it quite clear that they also weren't going to accept Indonesian nationalist declarations of independence. And so the British had their army operating in India and in Southeast Asia against the Japanese in the Second World War had not been predominantly English service people. There'd been a lot of English officers, but the subalterns, the soldiers, the foot soldiers, were invariably Indians. They were Indians who'd enlisted, or many of them had enlisted prior to the Second World War. They were looking for an income and they were, quite happy to be a part of the army structure. But many of them had enlisted also because of the Second World War and because the Japanese were trying to invade India. They'd invaded Burma, they were coming up, they were threatening India. One of the people who had enlisted for that reason as a nationalist was a journalist called P.R.S. Mani, P.R. Subramaniam, his name was, and he used the pen name Mani. He had actually been involved with Theosophists in Madras, where he came from, in Chennai, and he'd been involved in journalism for some years, but he enlisted probably in about 1942 in the British Army in order to fight the Japanese, and that's what he did. He was positioned as an officer. The British appointed him as an officer. He was a captain, and they appointed him to the communications, the PR section of the army. So he would be be involved in the sort of motivational work of the Indian soldiers who were fighting in Manipur and those areas in the eastern part of India against the Japanese. But much to everybody's surprise, when the war ended, the British assumed that they would just use all these troops, all of the people who'd enlisted in the British Army, as part of the Southeast Asian Command, which they did. So it was those Indians, including PRS Mani, the officers, who were taken to oppose Indonesian nationalism. And the British were attempting to restore Dutch control to the Netherlands East Indies. They were quite happy to accept the Japanese surrender, but the Japanese wanted to pass control over to the Indonesians, and the Dutch were in there. So it was a real mess, and the British made it very clear that they were supporting the Dutch and that they were only going to restore Dutch control. They were not going to accept Indonesian nationalism. One of the areas that they were active on. I mean, the British had warships all around the coast of the Netherlands East Indies, and they were attempting to move into the coastal cities. And the one that was controlled by the nationalists was Surabaya. It was a working class city. It didn't have an elite level it didn't have a noble level of the population. It had workers. It was a big industrial city and a port city, and it had been fully. The nationalists had full control of Surabaya, and they were operating the police force, and all the civil agencies were all being run by the nationalists at that stage. The British sent a set of officers and staff in to explain to the nationalists that they were going to take over, and the nationalists would have to fall back, and the Dutch would come back in. And in the melee afterwards, one of the British officers, the leading British officer, was shot and killed. And so the British assumed that the nationalists were opposing them, and they stood off the shore and they bombed the city to rubble. They damaged most of the city. There was a massive bombardment from the British. And then the Indian troops in the British Army were sent in to clean up the nationalists. And there was an enormous battle, and it was the biggest battle of the revolution, known as the Battle of Surabaya. And it's remembered as a great a battle of the nationalist independence movement. It was in fact against the British, of course, and in fact it was Indian soldiers who were sent in. And it was in this situation, one of the people in the PR group of the British forces was PRS Mani, who covered this with dispatches. Now, what we've got this wonderful body of archival material from Mani, donated particularly by his two sons, and I was able to access all of those. So we have Mani's dispatches, copies of which he kept in his own records. He resigned from the British Army after a while in Surabaya. It was so sickening. And he then went to work as a freelance journalist with the Free Press Journal of Bombay, which was a nationalist press. And he came back to Indonesia, back to Surabaya, and was sending posts from submitting posts to the Free Press Journal from Indonesia, from Surabaya and from Jakarta. And we've got those, but we also have his diaries, all of which are kept in this archive by his sons, who donated them to we organised for them to go to the National Archives of India, but I was able to have access to them, which was just wonderful. So from that, I was able to explore the story of the Indian troops who were being sent in by the British, Mani's perceptions both before and after his resignation, and when he returned and he was covering the nationalist struggle. And that allowed me, by looking at these archives, to see the stories about the Indian troops who'd crossed the lines. This was a period when there was still an anti-colonial struggle going on in India. The Indians were trying to get rid of the British out of India. So fighting for the British against the Indonesians in 1945, 46 and 47 was just appalling. So quite a lot of the Indians crossed the lines and fought alongside the Indonesians. So Mani was able to tell their stories. He interviewed people. So what this book is about is looking at those two conflicts, but it's also looking at the press in Australia and India. So I was, trying to get a sense of how this was being seen both by Australians and by Indians. So I was looking at right-wing and left-wing press, nationalist press and right-wing, colonial press in India, and I was looking at right-wing and left-wing press in Australia, as well as dispatches and the diaries of people like Mani. So that's what the book is doing. It's looking at both, because they're all sort of concurrent. It's looking at both the boycott and the battle, and looking at the way it's being seen from India and Australia. So it was an amazing story, and there was a lot that resonated with Aboriginal perceptions of colonialism, but there wasn't necessarily a lot of contact between the Aboriginal groups and the Indian seamen in Australia. There was an awareness and a consciousness, but there wasn't a lot of direct connections. Then we drew that to a close, and the arrival of independence in India and partition meant that, because a lot of the seafarers were either what became Bangladesh or what became Pakistan, the Indian Seamen's Union was really dismembered, and it became very hard to track. And so the Indian Seamen's Union in Australia really dissolved about 1949 or so, and it wasn't very simple to track that here, even though there was still, people of Indian descent who were on the ships, but they were now under different flags. And Devlina and I decided we would do some work perhaps on the women's movements because of independence. There was the whole union structure was disrupted, but the women's movements were still able to keep in touch, and they were. So we began this project where we were looking at the ways in which Indian women and Australian women were in communication, and we did some work through that. And did some writing, and we are still doing some writing, which we have yet to finish, and we will at some point. However, Devlina became very interested and involved in the renewables, the coal rush research project, which looked at coal mining and changing coal mining in Australia, India, and Germany, and really had a very important and interesting set of experiences in India in relation to that. And then since then has become very involved in the renewables industry in India, in Western India. So she's had less time and hasn't had the time to devote to the research. So we haven't finished this work yet. And what I've been doing is working on the other strand of important knowledge and stimulation that I drew from the work I'd done with First Nations people and Aboriginal people all the way up and down the river, which was about environment and water and their concerns about place and people's relationship to place really fed into the way that I was understanding the river, the Darling River, thinking about people's rights to water, First Nations, Aboriginal people's rights to water and cultural flows, and then environments generally. And out of that, I started working with Dennis Byrne, who's now at University of Western Sydney, but who was then the Director of Research at National Parks, who's just a lovely archaeologist, cultural archaeologist, and just a wonderful, wonderful colleague. And so he and we did a bit of work at Colarenebri together. I've got some great pictures of Dennis with his trying to work out where burials were within the Colarenebri cemetery. So we did some work with Isabel Flick on that. But Dennis and I initiated this research project about the Georges River National Park. We wanted to look at national parks, and instead of assuming that there was an intrinsic meaning to the natural world, we wanted to look at the way cultural difference was significant in generating meaning. So we wanted to look at a number of different cultural groups and looked at the way they understood this same one area. So that's what we did in the Georges River National Park study. And we did a lot of work. We had some wonderful research assistants, Alison Cadzow, Stephen Gaps. I mean, they were all just wonderful. And we worked with Arabic-speaking communities of a number of religions, obviously the Mandaeans and the Sunni Muslims mainly. We worked with Vietnamese people, again across a number of cultural groups. And we worked with Aboriginal groups. And Alison and I produced that book, Rivers and Resilience, where we were looking at Aboriginal history along the river. But we were trying to understand the ways in which cultural difference changed the perspectives that people had on the river. And we produced quite a lot of written material out of that, and we had some just wonderful experiences. It was just lovely fun and really enjoyable. And I spent a lot of time I really valued with both the Mandaeans and the Sunni Muslims. And the Shia Muslim groups were ones I was hoping to talk to at Arncliffe, but they'd sort of, they'd moved away. There were different groups of people, and I wasn't able to actually track people down. But the people for whom we hadn't published anything were the Anglo-Australians on the river. And so I had this feeling that I was frustrated that we had produced separate studies really for each cultural group rather than trying to understand. We tried to bring in other cultural groups into each one of the works we'd done, but I felt we hadn't done it very well. And we hadn't done anything really about the Anglo-Australians that were on the river, with whom I'd grown up. I mean, I'd grown up at Saltpan Creek, so I had this strong sense of this very different community which wasn't included in the groups that we talked to, or that I wasn't aware of them. So despite my continuing to work with I'd at this stage moved into, I was working with much more of the Indian and the stories about the Indians. I was also continuing to pursue the Georges River work, and I came back to that much more actively. And I was looking at the Georges River myself, but I also began to look at the Anglo-Australians along the river. And so it was their stories, and particularly the lower part of the river, where I was looking at the stories of the conflicts around environment that had taken place as there were attempts by councils and others to obscure the natural environment and to fill in the wetlands. So there'd been this series of struggles about, with local groups, people who didn't see themselves as environmentalists and who certainly weren't seen by the environmental movement as environmentalists, who were standing up to try and stop the infilling and the bulldozing of the mangroves. And so it was particularly, mangroves were sort of hated by everybody, but if the mangroves went, then the whole of the wetlands went. And so local communities were putting up defences of the mangroves, even though they weren't all that excited by it. And none of them really talked about the reasons that mangroves were expanding. Councils were arguing that they needed to do something about these wetlands because the mangroves were expanding and they had to all be dug up and bulldozed. And local communities were also aware that the mangroves were expanding, but they wanted to defend the wetlands, and so they defended the mangroves because they were the most notable feature. But nobody talked about climate change, interestingly enough. And the mangrove expansion was probably an early sign of climate change with warming of the seawater. And I mean, the final thing I suppose I want to say is that I had plans to do more to try and what I've realised is that those of us who wrote about and thought about the lower river, the saltwater river, and talked about how, it was important to recognise that rivers could be saltwater and saline and all the rest of it, hadn't actually thought about the upper part of the river, which is freshwater, and where it comes from. And the people, as I've discovered, who live in that freshwater area down to about Liverpool, have got no awareness of the saltwater part either. And so what I'd been hoping to do was to do a volume which drew them both together, which looked at the upper part where there's enormous conflicts going on about longwall mining and other sorts of dimensions of recent rapid development at places like Campbelltown, and to link that with the way that water flows in the saltwater parts and to link the two parts of the river. And I was going to look at wetlands, partly as a theme that went through it, but also there's other types of areas like the Appin Mine area has just moved one of the creeks, Brennan's Creek, which is a tributary of the Georges River, just filled it up with, waste and just moved it. It still exists, but, it's not the real river. So there's things like that all the way along, and it's been valuable meeting people in those upper freshwater areas and realising how little they know of the saltwater part, as well as how little we all knew. So that was my plan, but it's not to be at the moment. I've just done one little bit about a bit in the middle at De Freitas wetland at Fairfield, where an environmentalist whom I'd really admired, Sharon Cullis, had grown up and her father actually had put a lot of time into trying to defend it and, in fact, eventually pushing through its restoration. And Sharon had talked to me about it a lot. So after Sharon's death, I put more time into trying to understand what had happened in the processes. And that work's unfinished too, but it's somebody might finish it.
How do you think your own life has interconnected with your own work in terms of your childhood growing up in this place, next to Saltpan Creek, next to the river, in terms of, becoming an activist and becoming connected to communities, having a family, becoming a mum, and then obviously the friendships and the relationships that are formed. So I suppose, what do you sense is the relationship between your work as a historian and your interest in historical research and maybe the tributaries of your life that have fed that?
That's a really interesting question, Anna, and I've reflected on it in a number of ways. But when I was a child, I had two younger brothers, so we lived quite close to Saltpan Creek. But the last thing that little girls like me and our friends wanted to do was go to a muddy, polluted creek like Saltpan Creek. My little brothers loved it. They had bicycles. They travelled all over the suburb with their bikes up and down the hills, and they spent heaps of time in the mud and doing things like walking across the railway bridge, which I shudder to think about. However, they knew that area very well. It was a very contaminated river at that stage, as everybody knew. The Georges River was contaminated, Saltpan Creek was contaminated, and it was not a place where people fished for food they ate. People fished for interest, and they might have desired to be near it. Aboriginal people fished because they needed the food. And so I'd got to know Aboriginal people in the process of my research. I hadn't understood that one of my best friends in primary school was Aboriginal, but her parents had been so anxious about the kids being taken away that they'd impressed on her never to tell anybody. She was quite a fair kid, and never to tell anybody that she was Aboriginal. And I was horrified when I found later that she hadn't trusted me or anybody else enough to let us know that. And I wouldn't have been receptive at that stage. My grandfather had a sort of romantic, a story about, last of his tribe, the sort of, very romanticised sort of interest in Aboriginal people, but not an in-depth knowledge of Aboriginal people around Bankstown, as there were, as I found out later. And certainly I wasn't aware of the Saltpan Creek Aboriginal community in a way that I became later aware. So my main goal as I reached high school and then university was to get out. it was a terrible place. I thought the suburbs were terrible. I thought Saltpan Creek was polluted and the Georges River was boring, and I wanted to get away. So I get away and I came into Glebe, and I've lived around the inner city for the rest of my life. But my research then took me out to the Darling River, and I learnt a lot more about rivers and about Aboriginal people, which I'd never known. And I came to understand that there had been connections with people in the city, but I didn't learn much about Aboriginal people in the city. But I was very connected to the land rights movement, and I knew lots of people from different areas and different parts of the state. Friends like Isabel Flick, who'd gone back home to Collarenebri, was actively working in land rights. I had taught at Tranby College for quite a while, where Kevin Cook had become the director, and he was really committed to the land rights struggle, partly because, out of his own interest, but there were important people on the South Coast, Jacko Campbell particularly, Ted Thomas and others, who they were elders and they were real leaders in the land rights struggle, and they used to come backwards and forwards to Sydney, and they even, as the Western movement built up, they travelled out to Dubbo and they travelled out to the Darling River, and they built the links across the state, really. They were South Coast people connected to North Coast people to some extent, and they strengthened those links, and they brought together the quite different cultural regions of the state into this land rights struggle. And one of the people from the South Coast that I got to know very well was Jacko Campbell. And Jacko came from Dunghutti land around Kempsey and had escaped the kids being taken when he and his family came down in a dinghy. And he settled at Rosebery Park around there, married a woman from Rosebery Park, and stayed there for the rest of his life. So his kids are very strongly South Coast people. But Jacko came up, and we had one really memorable night when I had a bit to do with the research and the early filming of the film Lousy Little Sixpence, which was a lot of it was drawn from research that I'd done. And I was involved a bit with that. And Alec Morgan had discovered this Sinisan News review from 1933. 1933? 1930. Anyway, 1933, I think. And but it wasn't identified. It was King Burriga, but there was no identification. And I brought it home. I got an audio of that time. So we had Jacko and Ted Thomas sitting on the lounge chair. I thought it sort of possibly was, anyway, I thought they might know who it was because of their age and their involvement. And I've got the audio. I can hear Jacko saying, and I've listened to it recently, saying, that's him, that's old Joe Anderson. Jacko had lived at the camp, at the Saltpan Creek camp, recognised Joe Anderson, who called himself King Burriga really after his stepfather, Paddy Burrigalang from near Wollongong. And it was just a very short clip and very badly edited, but it's such a wonderful statement of demand for land and dignity and expression. And Jacko told me that Joe Anderson used to spruik this stuff at night around the campfire. He was a gummy. He used to drink methylated spirits, and he'd get charged up, and he'd be right in there, spruiking, talking this wonderful stuff. He was very strong, determined, a total gummy. But nevertheless, he was able to be picked up in this film. We think it was because one of his brothers had been an extra in another film that was being made at the time, one of those early Australian films. And so Jacko got picked up. He had something to say. And Joe Anderson got picked up because he had something to say and he was prepared to say it. And that footage of King Burriga is actually against Saltpan Creek shrubs. That's probably the mangroves. I'm not sure, but certainly against the shrubs at Saltpan Creek. And that's where the camp was. It was on the was actually on the eastern side of the river, whereas Padstow, where I grew up, was on the western side. And it was only later that I found out much more about it. But talking with Jacko gave me an insight, and I began to research it, and there was actually quite a lot of records of it in different ways. So my work as an activist, really, even more than my work as a historian, had brought me back to the Georges River. And I began to think about it in a different way, partly because I was seeing these communities whom I knew and people I cared about who'd had a background there. And I started to think about it as Aboriginal land, as Aboriginal water. And then increasingly I started to think about this place that I'd tried to escape from as being somewhere where I'd actually missed out on an enormous amount of understanding about the environment and the social groups that were there, because they weren't boring at all. They were very interesting. There was lots of fascinating processes going on, and these had, since I'd left, these had also become sites for immigrant groups to be settling. So there was so much that I'd missed, not only when I was there, but since I'd left, because I hadn't gone back very much. And so the Georges River National Park project allowed me to begin to see that. And I started to take much more of it on board as part of my own history. And so the last book that I wrote, that Georges River Blues, even though it was really from Saltpan Creek down, it actually was, I was very much talking to people whom my parents might have known, or I might have known if I'd stayed around a bit longer. And it was a really important book for me to write, because it really helped me to reconnect myself and to recognise that I'd been deluded about my sense of wanting to escape was all very well, but it had been limited and it had obscured my understanding of what the place was really like.
Amazing. I want to ask very briefly about history education, and you've had a long involvement with history education as an academic in universities, but also connected to the History Teachers Association, so lots of generations of students as well as researchers have an investment here. What do you think is the value of studying history?
Look, I think I haven't really had as much to do with thinking about education as I should have, or in terms of thinking about history education as such. My role in the History Teachers Association has been almost nominal, and I would have liked it to have been more extensive, but it didn't work out that way. And the role I've had at the university has been very much about, I think, encouraging people to think creatively about their own past. And I've tried to encourage people to think about memory and think about the recent past in a way which, rather than the distant past, I'm a very poor scholar of early colonial Australia, let alone of archaeology and pre-colonial Australia. So my knowledge is reasonably limited to the 20th century, and my goals were to encourage students to think about memory, to think about personal experience and the strengths and the limitations of perspectives and the ways in which people understood what was going around them and the different views that various people might have, the different perspectives they might have on events, and to explore those. So in that sense, even though I've encouraged people to look at archival sources because I've found them valuable, it's been about not regarding archival material without asking hard questions about how it was created and why it was conserved. But I've encouraged people to ask questions like that also about the memories that they might be recording or encountering, so that you couldn't assume that people's memories were the only way to see an event. And so what historians had to do as historians was to question the resources that they had and to try and explore collaboratively where possible, but that they had a responsibility as the analyst to try and explore the complexities of all of the resources that they were drawing on. And I've taught at Tranby. I taught history at Tranby, and that was just fascinating. I was encouraging people to explore their own histories, talk to their families, and in fact, most people were pretty eager to do that at the time. But they wanted qualifications. The people who were doing history at Tranby as mature age students were there for a reason. They were there for a purpose. They either wanted to get access to tertiary education or they wanted to get a promotion at work. So they needed a qualification. So we also had to look at the syllabus, and we had to look at ways to work with the syllabus to give people the tools they needed to get the qualifications they wanted. And at the same time, I've worked with Tranby staff and people and students to think about the history of Tranby. And that's the source of the website around the meeting tree. And I think one of the strengths of my interaction with UTS, with the Centre for Public History in the early days, before there was a Centre for Public History, when it was applied history, was understanding the strengths of digital work and the innovations involved in media and the capacity to reach outside the academy, to be thinking about the way people lived their lives and thought about the past and the present. And that's really what working at Tranby did as well. It was very much about being outside the formal academy or looking strategically at it as a way to, work with it and get through it and get what you wanted out of it in order to be able to do what you wanted.
So much of what's valued institutionally is metrics, research outputs, points, funding, whatever. And you have this, I mentioned at the very beginning of our chat, you've got 10 pages of this, so it's hardly something that you've been ignoring. But what I get from your work and from our conversation, I guess, is an impact that metrics can't measure. It's social justice, relationships, collaborations, relationships to place, relationships with colleagues, and also your research, collaborators. So I just wanted to finish off with a kind of a question of reflecting on your career, I suppose, which is what's been the most rewarding aspects?
The most rewarding aspects have been the sorts of experiences I had through things like working at Tranby and working with Aboriginal people and with Aboriginal people particularly, but also with, people who were working at community level in environmental groups or other ways, and trying to utilise what I was learning and what I could put together as a way to support them. And so I write because I like writing. That's what I do. That's the way I work. And if I was a painter, I'd paint things, and I'm not. I'm a writer. I write things, and so I write. But it's also helped me to think through puzzles about the past and to try and come to conclusions. But my goal has been to offer tools and strategies for people to understand the situation they're in and to make the changes that they want. And so to see the past not as a set of events which were out of the control of ordinary people, but to look at the ways in which ordinary people have been able to intervene or make the sort of lives for themselves that they wanted. And I think probably the most rewarding thing really, although I think the things I learned in something like the book about Indian seamen and Indian soldiers were lessons about colonialism and about the broader nature of colonialism and the connections that we have across the Indian Ocean, for example, and the Pacific, not just within settler groups, for example. But it's probably the most valuable thing I've been able to do is is bring a body of information and knowledge into Aboriginal community activism. I think that's been something that I've valued. I haven't taken an active role in writing about Aboriginal history very much for a long time because I felt very strongly that it was important that Aboriginal people were doing that. And that's one of the reasons that I've worked in other areas. But what I've tried to do, I think, is to expand the focus of the ways in which Aboriginal people have worked and to expand the focus of an attention to colonialism in Australia and the patterns of power and control so that we broaden it beyond simply looking at settlers and Aboriginal people, and we think about the connections that Aboriginal people have had with islanders, for example, in the Pacific, with Indians and others in the Indian Ocean, and to think broadly about not just Indigenous people connecting with Indigenous people, but these broader networks, so that we look at Fiji and we think about the connections between Indigenous people and indentured labourers. We think about colonialism, but we also think about activism and the activists that have been in connection with each other because of the way that colonialism has worked. So I think certainly my strongest simplistic sense is bringing resources into the debates and the awareness about Aboriginal people's history in Australia and offering tools to Aboriginal people. But more broadly, it's been about building, I hope, an awareness about the cross-cultural and the diverse networks that we've all been involved in the region.
Thanks, Heather.
That's all.
Fantastic to chat. Thank you very much.
History Lab.